Hi, everyone. I'm Shanna Smith, here again after our second Holy Hurt discussion. We'll just pass it around for a quick introduction.
Hi everyone, I'm Tina Days, also here for the second round of our Holy Heart discussion.
I'm Claude Jacobs. I'm here after our second round of discussion also.
And I'm Jill Hoyveld,
Thanks,
attending
guys.
discussion.
Um, so I'm going to give a quick summary of the Holy Hurt podcast episode 2 for everyone. Hopefully you've listened to it. This will make a lot more sense. And then we just finished up our discussion group tonight too that was very healing. In this episode, Dr. McBride goes into detail about how trauma and unprocessed feelings live in our bodies, how they can affect us physically if they're ignored or pushed down or suppressed. And she spent a lot of time talking about the systems that we're all a part of, our families, our churches, our local communities, our schools, our workplaces, and the broader cultural context that we live in, and the effects that they each have on each other and on our own sense of self. It was clear after listening to this episode that none of us are an individual on an island. We all affect each other at the psychological level and even the physical level in our bodies. And we can't view mental and physical health as two separate things, or spiritual health. They are all connected. And their physical symptoms that our body gives us actually can clue us in as to what parts of us need healing. And so these communities that we are in, they can harm us, but also if they're healthy communities, they can support us in healing because that being in relationship is so foundational for our bodies to feel safe. So that was really a quick summary of what Dr. McBride talked about. I encourage you to go listen to the episode. And now I'll just pass it off. Claude, was there anything that stood out to you when you were listening this week?
Yeah, I really appreciated the discussion about PTSD and complex PTSD. Generally, when I had heard of PTSD, it was in the context of wartime injuries or singular attacks. And so I was familiar with it from that perspective. I found it surprising to consider that church context could actually trigger PTSD outside of, say, physical assaults or CSA, SA. So the actual experience in the church, there can be a singular experience that causes PTSD, just like in a wartime or a certain physical assault. That is not a physical encounter. The other thing that stood out is that we can have events that are not a singular event. So there's something called a complex PTSD, which is a combination of factors, a combination of events. Neither of any of them can be pointed to as a singular source of your trigger, but the combination, the cumulative effect of all of those events together ends up creating a complex, complicated traumatic stress disorder. So it was interesting to consider that a church can be the source of that. It also is validating to realize that when we ourselves here and others that we have conversations with that were or are part of this church, others that we see on CCF platform, when they mention about certain triggers, that it's valid. It's valid that they're having reactions that are similar to a PTSD experience, and even if they can't point to a particular singular experience that causes their reactions, that there is the prospect of the cumulative effect of all of their exposure over time throughout their lifetimes around how they interact with meeting with the church or the constraints around meeting that would be in essence the equivalent of a PTSD experience. And so it helps me to consider that because there are times where I wonder if I'm maybe inflating the way that I react, the way that I feel. I wonder if maybe others may be overplaying it, if we're maybe babying ourselves or something, but it's not the case. That the feelings that we're feeling are valid, and even when we can't point to a singular experience, some of us can, and when we can, those are valid. And even if we cannot point to an individual experience, it is still valid because there is most likely a combination of factors that we endured within the community that is a cause of that. So I found that a really compelling idea, and it's something I will sit with more.
Yeah. Claude, just like hearing that information, and I think I mentioned this on our last talk too, but like the fact that we have this information on this podcast and from other resources, I'm so thankful for it. We heard in this episode that even getting information about what abuse is, like what spiritual abuse is actually the first step toward healing. Because, and this is how I felt, I think, not all the time, but maybe in the last 5 years or so. I couldn't really identify it, but when I would sit in some meetings, especially like I would say like a convention or a gospel meeting, some of the messages I was hearing, like something felt a little off. I had some feelings within myself, like I would have questions maybe about why I wasn't getting enough out of me, just different things that made me question myself. Things felt a little off. And when we're in it and when it's normal and we grew up in it, we won't be able to identify things that are wrong because it's normal. And so psychologically, what happens is our only answer then, especially as children, and then that kind of gets wired in as we get older, our only answer is why we're feeling so bad or why something is off is because we are bad, because we haven't prayed enough. We don't have enough faith. We haven't read our Bible enough. We are not wise like those who are speaking. And especially if we hear that message reinforced and preached, right? Like if you pray more, if you read more, then X, Y, and Z. And so I think that's why listening to this podcast has been incredibly helpful for me because it's been able to help me identify what the things are that might be harming me. That I had feelings, but I didn't have any words for it.
And that just feeds the power and control that the system has by sending messages to the congregation of not getting information, not seeking out information, and increasing one's awareness or education on what is actually happening within the system, right? It's this barrier, which is further abuse in itself because it's putting up these roadblocks to people getting to that point where they can do the healing. And so to me, that's further abuse that's happening in real time right now.
Yeah. It's interesting, like you mentioned, Claude, about like PTSD and complex PTSD, and we tend to equate that with like wartime or other kinds of what things that we would automatically think of as trauma. And I was thinking like how often we heard that we were at war with ourselves and with the threefold enemy, the world, flesh, and devil. And it kind of created maybe like a hyper awareness. And even just thinking of like, if I am upset with my husband, like before stepping away from meetings and unpacking all of that, I'd be like, oh, I have a hard heart. I haven't prayed enough. I haven't, I'm not responding to God's touch on my life kind of thing. Like, like there's a hardness in my heart and all of that kind of stuff. Like, instead of just like owning it, and like, oh, well, I'm really grumpy today. And my kids will joke like, oh, mom's hangry, watch out, or that kind of thing, like stuff like that. It has absolutely nothing to do with whether I prayed today or whether, because I can, anyway, that's another story, but those things. And I was also thinking of, it's in Oprah's book, The Body Keeps the Score, and how we can reframe, like so often we'll be like, our first instinct is like, what's wrong with you? Instead of what happened to you.
Yeah.
And just how important it is to just, even from ourselves, to look at ourselves and not think to myself, like, what is wrong with me? Like, why have I messed this up again? But to realize like what happened to you, like why, and then deal with it, and for myself to get the help that I need to move forward.
That's a really important point, Tina. I think when I read that Oprah's book, I think it's called What Happened to You.
Oh yes, I'm sorry. The Body Keeps the Score is a different book. Thank you.
Yeah. That question like changed everything for me. Because even now, like my husband and I have this conversation constantly when we see people on the street, when we meet new people, when we see someone who's having a hard time, instead of saying something negative or judgmental about them, we're like, huh, I wonder what happened to them. I
Mhm.
wonder what's going on right now for them. I wonder what their childhood was like, right?
Yeah.
And that instantly flips even your compassion for them.
Yeah.
Mhm.
And even to
And
look back, sorry, Shanna, I didn't mean to cut
no,
you
go
off,
ahead.
but even looking back sometimes, at people that I know for me, maybe I judged them for leaving meetings or for choices that they made or whatever. And now to look at that and think, wow, I wonder what did happen to them. I wonder like what caused that. Like, and again, to feel that compassion. And it's kind of like you're in this organization that's telling you, you need to pray more to have a softer heart or whatever. But when you learn instead to reframe and have empathy, the compassion is just there. Like it's not even something that you really have
Yeah.
to work at so much, because like you're looking at it from a different perspective.
And to the point that was being made earlier, the teaching, like the messages, there are certain things that are implicit, and then there are other things that are made explicit. And sometimes the implicit is reinforced by the explicit. And when you have messages that tell you that you are wrong, that the way you are made is flawed, that you're imperfect, that your natural state is wickedness, that you're sinful by nature, that your inclination is to be bad, right? If all of the natural messaging you hear about your own natural state is negative, then you internalize that. And that's something I think that both the first and second episode of this podcast has made clear, that when the messaging you're given, especially by people who are trusted with your spiritual development and who are seen as authorities with better understanding than yourself about how to connect to, we're all Christians here, so we would say God. For others in other worship traditions, whatever the deity is that they believe, however they would be attempting to connect to whatever higher power they're trying to connect to, if the person who they are entrusted with their training is telling them that their natural state is wrong, that their natural thought processes are wrong, the way they interpret things naturally is wrong, and now it has to be brought into line with the person who is teaching, because that person who is teaching has a direct line to God, then it sets up for further abuses. But even that initial training to have internalized self-doubt, to have internalized lowered self-worth, to have internalized reduction in your self-esteem, to allow that message to come in, that in and of itself is a form of spiritual abuse, because that person is using the power of holy writs, religious texts, their position as an authority figure in whatever your worship tradition is, to browbeat you, to now make you malleable so that they can move and shift you. And so to use those tools that are at their disposal in a position of trust to now manipulate you and to make you feel wrong so that you are more receptive to instructions, whether they be good or bad. Sometimes, we've seen many of those be poor instructions. That type of abuse, it's long lasting, and it's very difficult to unravel, because it's not just a person doing that to you just as one person to another. It's somebody who is a representative of a higher power than them. It's someone that you entrusted to connect you to a higher power than them. And I think that that's something that, I continue to unravel myself. And I think that that's other, and I've seen in other discussions, that's something that others are trying to unravel too.
Yeah, and Claude, that brings up for me when you talk about like abuse of those who are preaching or in positions of leadership in the church. What she made really clear in this episode is that those systems that are set up around the people reinforce the behavior, right? So, um, And she said, like, in cases like clergy sexual abuse, that rarely ever happens without there being an organizational, relational processes that
Mhm.
ignore, hide the abuse, um, support the way that they can perpetrate the abuse. And I was surprised by this number, but she said in churches, the number of sexual abuse cases that involve grooming are almost 90%, which is way higher than sexual abuse outside the church. But she also, something that was really interesting to me is that these systems fail not only the people that are being abused, but the abusers too,
Mhm.
like the clergy, when they aren't supported, when they have to suffer on their own, when they don't have places outside the system to go for help, for mental health, for trauma, if they don't allow them to be humans, to like need breaks and have
Mhm.
emotions, then you're creating leaders that are much more likely to hurt other people
Yeah,
because of the way the system is set up.
Right.
it creates empowerment struggle, right? So it, it basically these types of system create these challenges for individuals to actually advocate for themselves and what they need, because of this ongoing prolonged silencing. And we heard a lot about silence in that podcast, and affects one's ability to assert themselves and, you know, express their needs and identify their rights within the system. So yeah, it's very dangerous territory. And that suppression, you know, Dr. Gabor Mate, he always says suppression equals depression. And so when we consistently suppress what we're feeling, our needs, it leads to this cycle of a negative emotions that are basically buried within us that impacts our mental health and our relationships and our own personal growth. So, yeah,
A lot.
it's a lot.